Perhaps one of the greatest myths that so many singers grow up hearing is belting is bad for you. If that were true, how could so many incredible musical theater singers make decades-long careers out of belting on stage 8 times a week? Granted, belting is a highly demanding style of singing, and there are certainly things to avoid if you want to do it well and have a lasting singing career. Today, we're talking all about healthy belting. Is it possible? And what should you avoid in order to achieve it?
Hi, I'm Cynthia Cortman-Westphal, a Broadway music director, conductor, voice coach, and tenured professor in the musical theater department at the University of Michigan.
And I'm Chelsea Wilson, a performer turned voice teacher to Broadway stars and vocal coach on Broadway productions like The Phantom of the Opera, School of Rock, and more.
Here on the Broadway Vocal Coach podcast, you can expect real talk about the business, practical advice, and constant encouragement.
We believe there's space for every artist in this industry. All you need is the right support, so consider us your 2-woman hype team. Welcome to the Broadway Vocal Coach podcast, where we help musical theater performers get unstuck and take the next step in their careers. Cynthia, a couple weeks ago, we did an episode all about vocal health myth busting, and we mentioned in that episode there was a question about belting. Is it bad for you? Does belting cause nodes? And we said, let's table this for a longer discussion because that is such a big can of worms. Belting is a hot topic. And not only is it a hot topic, but it's an essential part of musical theater. It's an essential part of music and singing in general in contemporary commercial styles. It's crucial. So I feel like a lot of singers have fears or have some outdated beliefs about belting, and it leads singers to feel very confused and potentially belt in a way that is not healthy for them in the long run. Where do you run up against this word, and what feelings does the word belt conjure within you, Cynthia?
Well, I have to say, I love a belt. I love a belt. I love teaching belting. I love working with belting. I love all of the different varieties of belting, and there are a lot of varieties. I love dealing with super quiet belts and loud belts because there are different dynamics you can sing with a belt. I think one of the misconceptions with belting is that it's basically a shout or a scream and that it can only be loud and it can only be high and therefore it must be dangerous. So I've worked with a lot of folks who have come from a background where a teacher at some point has discouraged them from belting, saying that it's too dangerous. I really love working with those folks to find that indeed you can do it, and indeed you can do it healthily, and you can do it sustainably, and you can do it over the long term. Some of my favorite belters, and I'm sure some of yours, they are no longer 20-year-old spring chickens. They've got some age and wisdom on them, and they are still belting beautifully, sustainably, healthily. So I love a belt.
Amen. Amen. I totally agree. Similarly, I think I came from a very mix-centric technical background as a young singer, and that helped me in so many ways. And also, I had a preconceived notion that belting was just yelling in your chest voice as loud and as high as possible. And not really through any fault of my teachers, honestly. It was just like that was what I understood belting to be. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I was working with teachers and experimenting in my own voice in ways that I realized, oh, wow, I can find so much more power, strength, and more of a belty quality in my voice than I ever thought possible before, just because of the initial beliefs and initial perception that I formed around my own voice. So I think for a lot of singers, there are so many more possibilities with your voice and with belting, but without the right guidance or really a hands-on personalized approach to learn how to do this, you're really left in the dark. You're left to YouTube University to try and figure out how to do this. And while YouTube University is great, you can learn a lot. Just really no replacement for being able to work with somebody on your voice particularly. Well, with that being said, there's a quote that I love that I want to share at the top of this episode. Fantastic voice teacher Jeannie LaVetri has said, "Belting is peculiar. It's the only sound about which the following can be said. I'm a belter, belting out a belt song. You would never say, I'm a classicaler, classicalizing a classical song. And this is why I think there's a confusion around belting is it's like, how are we even using this word? And
Yeah.
to lay the foundation for our conversation today, there are so many ways to talk about belting, to talk about vocal technique, to talk about even what some people might consider to be very basic singing concepts, things like head voice and chest voice, which are very traditional terms within the singing community and voice teachers. A lot of people don't use those terms anymore. For my sake, I continue to use those terms and I'll use those terms in this episode. But there's really no right or wrong about the vocabulary. It's truly, as a singer, finding vocabulary that makes sense to you and helps you understand your voice and working with a teacher where you guys are on the same page vocabulary wise. But there's no right or wrong around these terms. Some other terms for chest voice, which we'll be talking about a lot today, might be mode 1 or thick folds or heavy register or low register.
I loved what you just said about the vocabulary. And I think sometimes we do get caught up in what should be the vocabulary, what is the vocabulary. And to me, the fact is, when it comes to individual singers, some people do respond really well to anatomy, to science. Some people don't respond well to that at all. They respond better to everyday prompts and metaphors and imagery that might be actually opposite of anatomy. Like maybe we're talking about a sensation that we're feeling behind our eyes when really anatomically it's a sound being made down in our throat. So sometimes the terminology doesn't even match what's actually happening. I always think of if anybody knows Men in Black, there's that scene where they sort of like crack open the face and there's that little alien is inside the head speaking. And I feel like, well, if I could just take the hinge and open up my face and show everybody what's in here and we could all look inside, that would be really cool. But we really can't unless we, use cameras for scoping, which that's another path we could go down. When it comes to belting, what I have found most successful is kind of working with whatever helps the individual the most. And sometimes that's science, sometimes it's metaphors, sometimes it's imagery. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to me as long as you're getting a healthy sound, a sustainable sound, a repeatable sound, and something that the singer understands. Eventually you want them to get to the point where they don't need the teacher prompting you over and over and over to get to it, that you want the singer to be able to access it themselves. And so whatever terminology or vocabulary works for that, I am sort of all for that.
I totally agree with you, Cynthia. I've had a teacher in doing teacher training with me say, I don't care if that student calls the sound purple. It's not purple, it's X, Y, and Z, but call the sound purple. If that's how they perceive that sound in their voice and in their body, sure, that's fine. So I just want to give all of our singers permission to experience this however you experience it in your voice. You're going to hear teachers all over the internet and teachers that you work with in person or online use all different language, and you just got to find a teacher and a language that fits how you perceive your voice and helps you make progress. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day. With that being said, let's get clear on a little bit of terminology and maybe a simple definition for what belting is. We've been dancing around this topic, belting, 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 belting. What is it? So the simplest definition that we can come up with today is loud, powerful, chest voice dominant style of singing. A belt sound usually kicks in around a singer's first passage, or you might call this your break, which is around an A4 or A above middle C for women and higher voice singers, and around an E4, E above middle C for men and lower voice singers. So we're talking about a quality, a style of singing that is powerful. Think Idina Menzel, think Cynthia Erivo, think Stephanie J. Block, fantastic men belters, Ben Platt, Aaron Tveit, people who are using really strong sounds in the middle and upper part of their range. What it isn't is synonymous with your chest voice or chest register, meaning the lower notes in your voice, the place where you speak, ah, 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 ah. Chest voice, you can sing in your chest voice in that lower spoken quality of your voice, both loud and soft, both breathy or clear. But what makes belting belting is that it has the potential to be a louder, brassier, more powerful sound. Now, Cynthia, you were saying already, because we're already going to clear this up and run into this, loud belts versus soft belts, or different qualities, right? Different styles.
We're already in the weeds.
There's the thing I'll say about that, though, and we don't have to get too much into that to like back that up, but great belting and a really great belt song. Let's think of the most classic musical theater. Well, so many classic musical theater choices to choose from, but I love to come back to Defying Gravity time and time again because it feels like the big one, right? The big one that everyone wants to be able to tackle at some point. Are the people who are singing that song just belting at double forte throughout the entire song? Absolutely not. That would be A, annoying, B, really difficult, and 3, there would be no emotional or story journey to go on in that song. So just because we associate belting, a belt style, with a certain song or a certain character or a certain style of music doesn't mean that we're just doing one thing throughout the whole piece, throughout the whole show. There's always a journey. And within this kind of belt quality, this kind of calling quality, there's a lot of variation. There absolutely is.
Yeah. And even talking Defying Gravity, I don't think anyone would ever say those singers are belting that entire song. They're belting parts of the song. They're mixing parts of the song. They're using some breathy head voice in part of the song. If you think of any song, if you honestly belted the entire thing, I think now we're headed into that old saying of like, if everything is important, nothing is important. If you've now given me that loud belt the whole time, we probably have lost all our texture, all of our nuance, all of our vocal journey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, belting is not necessarily a flavor that you need through the entire song, every note of the song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If you've been shopping around for musical theater college audition prep programs for your child and are looking for something a bit more white glove and full service, then I think we've got what you're looking for. There are 2 things that make our college prep program, BBC Aspire, different than many of the other college prep programs you can choose from. Number 1 is our timeline. We stand by our 4-month timeline for a number of reasons. You might be led to believe that you need to start choosing and rehearsing audition material in the fall or spring of your junior year. Not so. There is a sweet spot for audition prep, and that is the summer before senior year. Our 4-month timeline means you've got time to rehearse without running the risk that your material becomes stale. We lead all of our Aspire students to submit their completed applications and pre-screens by the end of September, so they're in the first crop of applicants that schools see while things are still fresh. Plus, by getting things done early, you can actually enjoy your senior year, spend time with family, get a part-time job, be in your school show, without having all of this stuff hanging over your head. The second thing that makes Aspire different from other college prep programs is everything is included. Many other programs are a la carte, meaning that you're paying for everything separately over the course of a long and potentially drawn-out process. With Aspire, we've put everything in one place and for one price to address families' needs in an efficient yet thorough program. No more cobbling together all the help you need. We've taken the guesswork out of the process and assembled a team to see you through to the end. Ready to get stressing over college audition prep off your plate? Schedule a free consult with us. Email us at hello@bwayvocalcoach.com or check the link in our show notes to book a call. We'll talk to you soon. Let's talk a little bit about some belting red flags. We're keeping the topic of today's conversation really about healthy belting and giving you some parameters to know and feel in yourself when you're achieving that and perhaps when you're not. So let's talk about some red flags. Number 1, it hurts. It doesn't feel good. So words that I ask my students in lessons, if they're experiencing a feeling of strain or pulling or squeeze, those are adjectives. Those are words that I associate with red flags of feelings we don't want to be experiencing really at any time when we're singing, not just belting, but any time when we're singing.
And I would add cough, tickle, or scratch.
Great.
If you've ever belted and have a spontaneous cough and all of a sudden your body just needs to cough, that's also, I think, a red flag. Some kind of tickle or a scratch, I think, is also a red flag. So, Chelsea, what are some other, we talked about it, hurting. Yes, red flag. What are some other red flags you feel like?
If your voice goes hoarse after a few attempts or a few passes through the song, that's a sign that what you're doing is not sustainable. And while stylistically it may be cool, if you can't, especially in our industry in musical theater where you're really being expected to do something over and over and over again so many times a week, if you're not able to do that and your voice goes hoarse, that's a red flag. The other one I'd mention
Mhm.
is just if that belt sound is inconsistent and unreliable. Now, that's a different thing from learning how to do this, right? And not being able to do it consistently yet, or it being unreliable at first. But if you're going into a show situation, say you've booked a job and you are being required to do defying gravity 8 times a week, then you have got to put yourself in a position where you've had the right training, the right support to be able to deliver that 8 times a week in a way that feels sustainable. Now, let's get into some belting truths because while those are some red flags, it all comes with a little bit of a caveat and a little bit more context, I think, is really helpful here. So, the first one I want to mention is belting and singing in general, it doesn't feel like nothing. Very rarely does any kind of singing feel like nothing. And I have a lot of singers that I've worked with over the years say, "Oh, well, I feel something going on and I've just been told it shouldn't feel like anything." I'm like, "Well, what do you think you're doing? Your muscles are working, you're
Yeah.
blowing air, you're using your posture, your whole body, your whole stance to be able to sustain and support this sound. Like, we're not doing nothing when we sing." So, sometimes I think even getting rid of that as an expectation as a singer can free you up to just try a whole bunch of things, kind of walk through the muddy swamp of discovery and trying to find new sounds and exploring and not going into a singing lesson or a new singing experience thinking, if I feel literally anything in my throat, spoiler alert, your vocal cords are in your throat. You are going to feel something happening in your throat. You're not doing something wrong if you feel something. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. You're going to feel something, but I do agree that I've heard a lot of students come in saying, I've just been told to relax, 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 that I have to relax more, too much tension, too much tension. And that's where I think a coach or a teacher can be so helpful because tension can be both a pro and a con. There will be some places where we don't want tension. There will be other places where maybe a better word than tension is muscle engagement. We absolutely need muscle engagement in certain places. And then we need other muscles to calm down a little bit. So just figuring out that coordination can take a bit of time and I think can be really difficult for a singer to figure out on their own if they don't have someone watching them, listening to them, helping to suss that out for them. That can be really tricky.
Yeah, totally agree. Another belting truth, and this is surprising to a lot of people, is that belting requires less air than you
Yes,
think.
amen.
In
Mhm.
fact, singing in a more classical or in musical theater, what we refer to often as a legit style, requires quite a bit more air because your vocal folds when you're belting are pressed very firmly up against each other, resisting the airflow well. Ah, 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 as opposed to ah, 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 allowing more air. And so, belting, in the fact that we're singing with a more firm sound, we're resisting the airflow quite intensely, just as a nature of what this sound sounds like. You don't need to blow or push so much air through. And in fact, when folks do
Mhm.
that, that's
Mhm.
often when they run into trouble.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics of belting is air, the amount of air and breathing because I think it's counterintuitive. I think people often think I have to tank up, get my biggest amount of air and my lowest breath in order to make this big loud sound and it's almost the opposite. And I think
Mm,
just it's counterintuitive. And I've heard over the years a number of times, just as an outside observer, when I've seen either music directors coaching a singer or even a fellow actor trying to help out a fellow actor, you just got to get a deeper breath. You got to get a bigger breath. And I always think, no, opposite. Let's not do that. But it makes sense. You think you're making a really big, loud sound, think you need a ton of air, and it's the opposite. One of my favorite Estill exercise you'll do when learning about some of this is just shouting, hey. Like, imagine that you're at a football game and you're going to suddenly stand up, somebody just scored. It's really exciting. And you're just going to stand up and yell, yay, or hey. If you do that on your own, you're probably not going to go, hey. You're simply going to stand up and go, hey. You're going to make that big loud sound without doing a big breath in. So we sort of naturally do that all the time when we do big yells. If you've ever, yelled for a parent, or if somebody ran off with your phone and you're like, hey, you don't first prep it by going, hey. So, in real life, we don't take these big breaths before we make big, loud sounds. So it's very similar then to when we make these big, loud sounds singing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Another belting truth here is that belting comes in many form and many styles, or many different registrations, perhaps. Some of the really common ways that I hear belting described, and perhaps how singers describe how they experience belting, is something like a chest belt, something where they're just staying in chest voice. A mix belt, they're putting a belt style or some belt technique over the top of their quote mix voice. And then we get into stylistic and genre things like a pop belt versus a Broadway belt versus an R&B belt, etc., etc., etc. There's so many different ways to stylize this style.
Yeah. Nasal belt, oral belt, ORAL. I've heard those. I sometimes use a term called hollow belt. No one knows what that means unless you work with me, but that's another, there's, we've all kind of got our different ways of describing different qualities of sound that are all variations of a belt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say about this and kind of our belting truths is that because there's so many ways one can experience this in their own voice, or that a teacher might guide a student to experience this in their voice, there's no one right way to learn. Every voice is different, and you may need to try a whole bunch of different tools. And this is where a great voice teacher comes in. Someone who is trained as a voice teacher, not just a style coach or a vocal coach who's going to help you with things like interpretation or learning music, but someone who's really trained in technique and things like vocal anatomy. Whether or not that's your jam, your teacher will know about that and be able to use that information to guide you through a lesson that makes sense for you, even if we're not talking about explicit vocal anatomy terminology. So just know there's a lot of ways to go about this. And we're going to leave you at a frustrating cliffhanger here to not tell you how to do it, because we can't. We cannot possibly prescribe in this episode, one way for every person to be able to find what feels like a healthy belt sound.
I will add that one thing I often hear from people is, I'm not a belter. I can't belt. I'm a head voice singer. And they'll make these qualifications about themselves. And I love what you said, Chelsea, about there's no one right way to learn. There's lots of ways into a belt. And what I would say, my opinion, every single person can learn how to belt. Every single person. And the other thing I would say is, it's going to come easier for some people than others. That doesn't mean you can't learn, even though it's maybe not your default setting of what comes easiest to you in your singing. One of the analogies I often use is Michael Phelps, the great Olympic swimmer. His proportions happen to be such that, when you look at the proportions between his torso and his legs and his wingspan and all of that, he literally is built to be the best swimmer in the world. But anyone can learn to swim. So you might not be the biggest highest belter ever in the history of belting, but you can still find your way into belting and have it fit beautifully in your voice. So it may come easier for some than others, but I really do believe everyone can learn. And I think everyone has access to this with some good training and a good teacher who can help them through it. One thing I might add when practicing belting, I've got a couple rules, especially if you aren't maybe working with someone consistently. And, let's be honest, not everybody has the time or the funding to be able to work with someone consistently. And so you might be getting some tips off YouTube or off other social media, which is great. You can find some really good things there. But if you are working more on your own, or even if you are working with a teacher, a couple of my guidelines are monitor these three things at all times. And the first of those is air pressure. So that's the amount of breath that you are taking in. So the difference between a big, huge breath and then belching, which often can lead to what we were talking about, a strain or a squeeze or this sort of a grunting kind of sensation, versus taking in maybe just a sip of air, or you could even practice blowing some air out before you do your belt. So just monitoring your air pressure. Just monitor, did I just take the biggest breath of my life before I sang that belting line? That's one thing. The second thing is to monitor your volume. This is another one that the quality of belting is already pretty loud. So if you are singing everything at a forte, everything really loud, that's another place where you can start to be getting into some strain. So could you dial it back just a little bit? Could you sing at a 7 instead of a 9.5 and just monitor your volume a little bit? And then the third thing would be monitor your reps. How many times are you doing it over and over and over and over and over? Those are just three of my guidelines when you're practicing. It's just low air pressure, lower volume, and fewer reps. Because we are talking a really athletic style of singing. And especially if you don't have someone guiding you through it in a lesson or on a regular basis, those are just three ways that you can kind of do your own monitoring of your own safety.
I love that you said that about reps, because I think even the most elite singers, folks with impeccable technique, people who are in voice lessons every week, who consider themselves really great belters, they may only have so many passes of this given song in them in a singing session. And that's really normal. Back to
Yeah.
this idea of, oh, I shouldn't be feeling anything when I'm singing, or maybe the belief that, oh, well, if I'm doing it right, I could do it 100 times. No. Again, get rid of
No.
that expectation as well, because it's not serving you. It's an unhelpful expectation. It's not a realistic expectation. You may very well be playing Elphaba on Broadway 8 times a week and know I've got it 8 times a week in me. And this is the kind of
Yep.
vocal warm up I do on a show day. And I go and I do the song, I do the show once. And at the end of the show, I'm tired. I like to talk with singers a lot about spending and saving, vocally spending and saving. You can apply this to, if you're in a show, your entire show, your 90-minute or 2-hour plus show, or the song that you're singing. So if I'm playing Evan in Dear Evan Hansen, I've got 7, 8 big numbers that I've got to sing through. And not every one of them can be a $1 song, okay? Give yourself a $10 budget for the entire show. Okay, waving through a window, you can spend $1.50 on that song. But then you've only got $8.50 left to spend vocally throughout the rest of the show. So you have to budget appropriately. Know that there is a limit on your stamina, on your energy, on the vocal load that you can take. And just because you have found great technique and you're doing things, in a way that's quote healthy, doesn't mean that it's not going to wear on you, be tiring, and that you're going to need and want to take breaks. Setting yourself up with these appropriate expectations is really crucial if you want to go into, honestly, a singing career in general. We can just apply this to singing in general, not just belting, but a singing career that's sustainable and that you can really hold yourself accountable to.
Yep, I agree 100%. And it's why I often use the term athletic, because
Yeah.
just like you wouldn't ask an athlete to play 5 basketball games in one day, or to sprint the 100-yard dash 16 times in the span of 2 hours. We know that when we're doing these really athletic, high-octane events, our body only has so much to be at its top form, and then it's diminishing returns. When you're practicing, that's where it's just a really good idea to keep on monitoring what's my most comfortable vocal effort. Keep monitoring your air pressure, your volume, the number of reps, and just be really paying attention to that. I love your budget. That's such a great analogy.
Thanks.
Even when you're practicing, be aware of that budget.
Yep, that's it. I'll even apply it to different parts of the song. So if you say you're just applying it to one part of the song, you've got $1 to spend. Okay, this is your 10-cent note. You've only got 90 cents to make it through the rest of the song. Really be clear about how much energy you have to give.
I love that.
These are great tips, Cynthia. I love your 3 guidelines of things for people to keep in mind when they are practicing on their own or even in voice lessons, monitoring their air pressure, their volume, their reps. That's so helpful. And I hope that this conversation in general has opened your mind to what might be possible with belting and encourages you to seek out some great training, some good coaching, so that you can feel like your best self, your best belter.
Happy belting.
Happy belting. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a screenshot, tag us on Instagram at B-Way Vocal Coach, share this episode with a friend, and consider leaving us a review. And if you're ready to take your next step in this industry, but aren't entirely sure what that should be, then take our quiz. We'll strategize with you to outline a roadmap to your unique goals. Plus, from there, you can book a free consult with us. Visit bwayvocalcoach.com/take the quiz. We can't wait to hear your story and help you take the next step in your career. Thanks for listening.